Before you judge me, let me tell you how I got here. For 20 years, I built my life around one man, my second husband, Edward Hayes. I cooked his meals, washed his clothes, drove him to endless doctor appointments, and stayed beside him through every hospital stay, believing that's what love meant. That's what a good wife did. Until the day I overheard him say I was nothing but free labor. It was early morning, the hospital corridors still half asleep, the air heavy with disinfectant and stale coffee. Edward had been admitted for a minor stroke. The doctor said he'd recover fine. I arrived as usual, balancing his favorite oatmeal muffins and 2 cups of coffee, still warm. When I reached his room, the bed was empty. The nurse smiled politely. "He's in the courtyard getting some fresh air." I followed the faint hum of voices until I reached the sunlit garden, where he sat in his wheelchair, chatting with another patient, a man maybe half his age. I was about to call out when I heard his voice light, smug, and cruelly familiar. "I tell you, I've got it made. She's a younger woman, does everything. Cooking, cleaning, feeding me, even handling the bills. I don't pay a cent for any of it. That's what I call a smart investment." The man laughed. Edward chuckled too, basking in his own words. "When I'm gone, the money goes to my son. Dylan may be a handful, but he's blood. As for Clara, she'll manage. She's used to making do." I froze. My shoes felt nailed to the floor. The sunlight blurred into white noise. He didn't even lower his voice. I waited for him to laugh, to say he was joking, but he didn't. The conversation drifted to sports, and my world quietly collapsed behind a hedge of roses. I backed away like a ghost, my pulse roaring in my ears. Every sound, the squeak of a gurney, a nurse's laughter down the hall, felt distant, unreal. For 2 decades, I had believed we were building something together, but the truth was simpler, crueler. I had been maintaining his comfort, his pride, his legacy, a legacy that excluded me. When I finally returned to the room, he was lying back in bed, the picture of fragile charm. "There you are," he said, smiling faintly. "Did you get the muffins? You shouldn't tire yourself out. You're the one person I can always count on." "Count on." I smiled back, or something like it, and placed the muffins on the tray. Inside, something hollow and cold began to form. That evening, as I sat by his bed, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, I realized the truth. I hadn't been caring for a husband. I'd been tending to a con, and from that moment on, every breath I took was quieter, sharper, more deliberate, because I was done being useful. I was done being loyal to a lie. So if you've ever given everything to someone who treated you like convenience, stay with me till the end. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when a woman finally decides that being kind is no longer the same as being silent. I'm glad you're here. Give this story a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far truth can travel, because the one I'm about to tell you tore through my family like a wildfire that refused to die. The day Edward called me his free caregiver, something in me died, but something else began to breathe. When I returned home from the hospital that evening, the California sunlight streamed through the windows, thick and golden, but it couldn't warm the house. It never really did. Even after 20 years, it still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, a ghost of the woman who came before me. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Edward and his late wife, Margaret, beach vacations, family holidays, smiling faces frozen in time. My picture was nowhere among them. I dropped my bag on the floor and just stood there for a while, watching the dust float through the light like tiny ghosts of moments that were never mine. The kitchen clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, and I suddenly realized how deafening silence can be when you finally hear it. This house was never mine. Not really. When Edward and I married, I moved in with 2 boxes of books, a cat, and a heart full of hope. He'd insisted we stay here. "Too much hassle to move," he said. "This is home." But he never meant our home. He meant his. The house where Margaret's curtains still hung, where his son Lucas still stomped around as if I were the unwelcome guest. I remembered that first Thanksgiving. I had spent 2 days learning how to roast a turkey, perfectly basting, seasoning, timing each dish so dinner would be ready right as they walked in. When I set the table, Lucas looked at the spread and said, "Mom's stuffing was better." Edward had laughed, pouring himself a drink. "Don't take it personally, sweetheart. You know how boys are." But it wasn't about boys. It was about boundaries, about how I didn't have any. For years, I swallowed the disrespect. I told myself love required sacrifice, that if I just gave more, they'd eventually see me. That one day, maybe, I'd belong. But now I knew better. I had never been a wife in their eyes. I was an employee who never got a paycheck. I sat on the couch, the same one where I'd rubbed his back during every flu, every hangover, every complaint. My hands trembled. I pressed them to my knees until the shaking stopped. I wasn't angry yet, just hollow. The hollowness scared me because it wasn't temporary. It was freedom in disguise. When the doorbell rang, I flinched. It was nearly 8. Lucas stood on the porch, wearing a hoodie that smelled of cigarettes and arrogance. Without asking, he brushed past me and went straight to the kitchen. Dad said he might get discharged soon, he said, rummaging through the fridge. You'll have to get that sorted. We can't deal with chaos later. Chaos. That's what he called his father's health, his inheritance, his plan. He pulled out a Coke, popped the tab, and smirked. You know, when Dad's gone, I'll probably sell this place. It's too big anyway. Maybe you can move back in with your daughter or something. My throat went dry. I wanted to scream, to throw him out, to tell him exactly how small and spoiled he was, but I didn't. I didn't need to, because in that moment, I saw it clearly. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. Edward had raised a man who treated kindness as currency, and I was done paying. Lucas finished his drink, dropped the can on the counter, and walked out without saying goodbye. When the door closed, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet. It was sharper, cleaner, like the air right before a storm breaks. I walked to the living room and turned off every light except one small lamp. Its glow spread across the floor, soft and gold, like a secret promise whispered to no one. Then I whispered it aloud anyway. I'm done. Not loud, not defiant, just final. For the first time in 20 years, those 2 words belonged to me and me alone. Edward came home from the hospital 3 days later. The sun was merciless that morning, too bright for a day that already felt heavy. As the nurse wheeled him to the car, he grinned and said, "Feels good to be home." Home. The word landed on me like a bruise. I smiled back, the polite, practiced kind of smile that never reached my eyes, and helped him into the passenger seat. His hand brushed mine for a second, and I felt nothing. Not tenderness, not anger, just emptiness. He complained about the seatbelt, about the air conditioning, about how the nurse didn't wheel him properly. Every word was a reminder that I had once confused responsibility with love. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller somehow. The white shutters needed repainting. The roses I'd planted last spring were wilted, and the welcome mat had faded from years of footsteps that never truly welcomed me. Inside, everything resumed as though the world hadn't shifted. Edward switched on the TV and asked me to find his hunting photo album. I fetched it automatically, my hands working on instinct, the same way they had for years. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. I was studying the man I'd built my life around. The slope of his shoulders, the frown lines etched deep into his forehead, the way he expected the universe to bend around him. And, for the first time, I didn't feel pity or duty. I felt curiosity, like I was observing a stranger I'd once mistaken for love. Later that evening, as he napped on the couch, I went through his hospital paperwork. Bills, insurance forms, discharge summaries, endless pages of his life reduced to numbers and codes. I was sorting them into folders when a single page slipped out and landed face down on the carpet. It was an insurance document, printed neatly on heavy paper. Beneficiary: Lucas Hayes. Contingent beneficiary: Margaret Hayes. His first wife. I stared at the names. My name wasn't there. Not even as an afterthought. It wasn't about money. God knows I'd never cared about that. It was about what it meant about being erased, even in death. 20 years of cooking, scrubbing, nursing, enduring, and in the end, I wasn't even worth a line of ink. The paper trembled in my hands. I folded it neatly and placed it back into the folder, as if touching it too long might poison me. Dinner was quiet that night. I made lasagna, his favorite. He took one bite, frowned, and said, "You didn't use mozzarella, did you?" "No," I replied, my voice calm. "We were out." He scowled. "Doesn't taste right without cheese. You're slipping lately." I didn't answer. He looked at me for a long moment, waiting for the usual apology. When it didn't come, he shook his head. "You've been acting strange." "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I just see things more clearly now." He blinked, confused, then turned back to the TV, muttering about reruns. I sat across from him in silence, the faint blue light flickering across his face. For the first time, I truly saw him the entitlement, the smallness, the emptiness he tried to disguise as authority. And I knew. I didn't love him anymore. I wasn't even sure I ever had. What I'd loved was the idea of partnership, of belonging, of purpose. But those were illusions roles I'd written myself into out of fear of being alone. When the credits rolled and he drifted into sleep, I stood and walked into the kitchen. The smell of tomato and garlic clung to the air. I washed the dishes slowly, one by one, my movements deliberate, my heartbeat steady. By the time I finished, a strange calm had settled over me. This wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was awakening. I dried my hands, leaned against the counter, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "It's time." 2 words that didn't ask for permission. 2 words that tasted like oxygen. The following morning, the world looked ordinary, but nothing in me was. The house that once held routine now felt like a stage I had outgrown. Every detail, the ticking clock, the steady hum of the refrigerator, even the half-open blinds letting sunlight stripe across the floor mocked me with the same quiet question. How long will you keep pretending this is home? Edward was in the living room watching a hunting documentary. His feet were propped on the ottoman, his glass of lemonade sweating onto a coaster I had crocheted myself a decade ago. When he saw me, he smiled. "Morning, Clara. You're up early." "I didn't sleep much," I said. He barely looked away from the screen. "You should nap later. No point in running yourself ragged." For 20 years, I had mistaken such remarks for concern. Now, I heard them for what they were, commands dressed as care. I made him breakfast, oatmeal, toast, and half a banana. He complained about the toast being too crisp. I said nothing. After cleaning the dishes, I went into his study. The small, square room smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish. Every drawer, every shelf, every file was labeled and ordered his pride and joy. I opened the bottom drawer, where he kept insurance forms, just to double-check the paperwork I'd seen the night before. But there was something else, a manila folder labeled private. Inside, I found printed statements from an investment account I didn't recognize. The balance: $380,000. The beneficiary: Lucas Hayes. Not our account. Not even joint. Just his. And just for his son. I should have felt shock, but I didn't. Instead, a strange calm came over me, a clarity that made the edges of everything sharp. All those nights I stayed awake paying his bills, all those mornings I stood in pharmacy lines to refill his prescriptions, all those sacrifices, they hadn't been acts of love. They'd been transactions in a contract I hadn't realized I'd signed. The sound of his voice from the hallway broke the silence. "Clara, have you seen my reading glasses?" "They're on the coffee table," I called back, closing the drawer quietly. When he shuffled back to the couch, muttering thanks, I leaned against the desk, staring out the window at the lemon tree I'd planted our first spring together. Its branches were heavy with fruit, gold and ripe, but unpicked. I remembered how excited I'd been that day, kneeling in the soil, thinking I was planting roots that would finally belong to me. Now I saw the truth. The tree had always belonged to him. I had just been tending it. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside the grocery store, engine off, fingers gripping the steering wheel. People passed by carrying flowers, coffee, groceries, the simple hum of lives moving forward. And for the first time in decades, I realized mine had stopped. Something had to change. I drove home, parked, and sat there until the porch light flicked on. Inside, Edward was dozing again, his mouth slightly open, the TV murmuring. I watched him through the window, not out of nostalgia, but detachment. He had built a world where I was necessary but never valued, and I had agreed to live inside it. That night, I opened my old address book and found a number I hadn't dialed in years. Naomi Tran, my oldest friend. She was the only one who'd ever told me I deserved more than being someone's caretaker. My thumb hovered over the call button. My heart pounded once, twice, then steadied. When she answered, her voice was bright, familiar. "Clara, it's been ages." I exhaled. "Naomi, I need to talk. Can I come by tomorrow?" A pause. Then warmth flooded her tone. Of course, honey. You don't even have to explain. Just come. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, the house completely still. Edward snored softly down the hall, unaware that the foundation of his quiet empire had just begun to crack. I looked at the folded insurance document on my nightstand, the one that proved how small my place in his life really was. And for the first time, I didn't cry. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. Naomi's flower shop was the kind of place that smelled like renewal. Even the air felt different there, saturated with lavender, soil, and something gentler than pity. The next morning, I arrived before the store even opened. Naomi spotted me through the window, her face softening immediately. She wiped her hands on her apron, opened the door, and pulled me into a hug that nearly undid me. "Clara," she whispered. "You don't have to say a word yet. Just breathe." For the first time in months, I did. She led me to the back patio, where sunlight filtered through trellises wrapped in jasmine vines. There was a round table set for two, a chipped teapot steaming between us. I didn't plan to tell her everything, but once I started, it poured out the hospital corridor, the insurance documents, the way Edward's son had spoken to me as if I were furniture. My voice trembled at first, then steadied, like a wound being lanced clean. Naomi listened quietly, her eyes calm but fierce. When I finally fell silent, she set her teacup down with a quiet click. "He doesn't love you, Clara," she said, not unkindly. "He loves convenience. He loves having someone to cushion his consequences. That's not love. That's dependency with manners." I tried to protest, to make excuses, but she cut me off with a look that could slice glass. "Don't you dare defend him," she said. "You've already spent 20 years doing that. You don't owe him another sentence." The tears that had been threatening finally came. I buried my face in my hands, my voice breaking through the cracks. "I'm 60, Naomi. Where do I even go now? I've spent half my life taking care of him. I don't even know who I am without that." Naomi's voice softened, but stayed sharp. "Then it's time to find out. You can stay here. The apartment upstairs is empty. It's small, but it's yours if you want it." I shook my head. "I can't just—" "Yes, you can," she interrupted. "You've spent years asking permission from men who never deserved it. You don't need it anymore. You just need to walk out that door and not look back." I laughed weakly through my tears. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," she said. "It's necessary." We sat there for hours, watching bees move lazily between the flowers, sipping tea gone cold. By the time I left, I felt something I hadn't in a long time possibility. That evening, I packed slowly. Not frantically, not angrily, calmly. Every item I chose felt deliberate. The photo of my daughter, Sophie, from her graduation day. The blue sweater Naomi had given me the year Edward forgot my birthday. The worn paperback of The Color Purple with notes scribbled in the margins. When Edward came home from physical therapy, I was still in the bedroom folding clothes into a suitcase. He paused in the doorway. "Going somewhere?" "Eventually," I said, "but not tonight." He frowned, confused, but said nothing. After he went to bed, I stood in the doorway watching him sleep, the soft rasp of his breathing filling the room. Once, that sound had comforted me. Now, it only reminded me of all the nights I'd listened to it while feeling completely alone. I turned off the light and whispered into the dark. "This time, I'm choosing me." The next morning, I drove back to Naomi's shop. The air smelled like wet roses from the early rain. She was already waiting at the counter, holding a set of keys. When I took them, I felt a weight lift from my chest, a quiet, invisible chain I hadn't known I'd been dragging. "I don't know what happens next," I said softly. Naomi smiled. "You don't need to, you just need to start." And for the first time in 2 decades, I did. That evening, after moving the last of my boxes into the apartment above Naomi's shop, I sat on the floor among them, too tired to unpack. The scent of lilac and soil drifted through the cracked window. Below me, I could hear Naomi, humming softly as she arranged bouquets for the next morning's orders. For the first time in 20 years, no one was calling my name. No one needed a glass of water. No one was complaining about dinner. No one was sighing loudly to remind me of all I'd failed to do. The silence didn't feel lonely. It felt mine. I lay back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't much, just a small square room with faded paint and a lamp that flickered, but it was a beginning. Still, beginnings don't erase endings. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear Edward's voice. "She's nothing but free labor." That single sentence replayed in my head like a stuck record. By the next morning, I was back at his house, but only to collect what was left of my dignity. The place looked smaller, almost pitiful. Edward sat in his recliner, a blanket draped across his knees, the television blaring. Lucas was slouched at the table, scrolling through his phone. Neither looked up when I entered. "Ah," Edward said after a moment, glancing over. "There you are. Did you bring groceries?" I shook my head. "No. I came to pack the rest of my things." He frowned. "Pack? For what?" "For my life," I said. Lucas let out a low laugh. "You serious? You're leaving? Now?" I didn't even glance at him. I walked past them, into the kitchen, and started emptying the cabinets of the few items I'd bought myself. A mug with a chipped handle, a jar of honey, an old teapot. Edward's voice followed me. "Clara, don't be ridiculous. You're upset, that's all. Let's not make a scene." I turned to face him, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "I've been quiet for 20 years, Edward. You can't call it a scene when the silence finally ends." He blinked, caught off guard. Lucas muttered something under his breath, smirking. "Guess she finally grew a spine." I met his gaze coldly. "You should try it sometime." The words hung in the air, sharp, final. Edward stood abruptly, the blanket falling from his lap. "You can't just walk out. This is my house." I nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I'm leaving it." I carried my suitcase to the door. My hand was already on the handle when he said, "You'll regret this." I turned. "No, Edward. What I regret is staying this long." Then I stepped outside and shut the door. It didn't slam, it clicked softly, like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 2 decades to write. Naomi was waiting in her truck across the street. She didn't ask questions. She just started the engine and said, "You sure you don't want to look back?" "I already did," I said quietly. "For 20 years. That night, I unpacked slowly. Naomi made us dinner, simple tomato soup, and bread still warm from the oven. We ate in the garden beneath a string of fairy lights, the air heavy with the scent of rain and roses. Halfway through the meal, I realized I was smiling. Not politely, not out of habit, but because something inside me had shifted. After dinner, I climbed the narrow stairs to my new apartment. The moonlight spilled across the wooden floor, illuminating the stack of notebooks I'd carried with me from the old house journals I'd once filled with grocery lists, appointment reminders, and Edward's medication schedules. Now, I opened to a blank page. At the top, I wrote one line. "I am no one's caregiver anymore. I am my own witness." Then I closed the book and went to bed, the faint sound of Naomi's laughter drifting up from below. And for the first time in 20 years, I slept through the night without dreaming of anyone else's needs. The first week in Naomi's apartment felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. The space was small, just one room, a kitchenette, and a window that looked out over the flower shop's courtyard, but every inch of it breathed freedom. I woke up early each morning to the scent of damp soil rising from below, as Naomi watered the garden. Sometimes I'd sit by the window with a mug of tea and watch her work bare hands in the dirt, laughter spilling out when she spoke to customers. She moved through life with the kind of ease I had forgotten existed. By the second week, I started helping downstairs. It began as small gestures, trimming stems, sweeping petals off the floor, arranging tulips in vases. But soon, Naomi insisted on paying me. "Friends don't work for free," she said, pressing a few folded bills into my hand. I wanted to refuse, but she shook her head. "If you don't let people value your time, you'll end up giving it away again, and I won't watch you do that." So, I accepted. Day by day, I began to unlearn the habits of servitude. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped thanking people for basic decency. I stopped measuring my worth in chores completed or meals prepared. But the quiet hours still had teeth. Some nights, I'd wake up sweating, my mind replaying Edward's voice. "You'll regret this." It would echo in the dark like a curse. Then I'd remind myself of something Naomi said. "You can't regret walking out of a cage when the door was always open. You can only regret not walking out sooner." Her words anchored me. 3 weeks after I left, a letter arrived, no return address, just my name scrawled in Edward's familiar handwriting. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The weight of it told me everything I refused to hear again. Instead, I took it downstairs, set it in the sink, and lit a match. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Naomi walked in just as the last ember died. Was that what I think it was? I nodded. She didn't ask for details. She just handed me a small pot of daisies and said, "Then plant something better in its place." I smiled, placing the pot on the windowsill upstairs. Its petals leaned toward the light, stubborn and soft like me. Around that time, I reached out to my daughter, Sophie. We hadn't spoken much since my remarriage. She'd moved to Boston years ago to become a paralegal, and I'd always made excuses not to visit. Edward didn't like traveling. Edward didn't like her tone. Edward, always Edward. When she answered my call, there was a pause. Then, quietly, "Mom?" Just hearing her voice cracked something open in me. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered. I left him. The line went silent again, then I heard her exhale, shaky but full of relief. "Good," she said simply. "About time." We spoke for an hour about her job, about Boston's endless rain, about how she'd always known I was meant for more than someone else's shadow. When I hung up, I realized I'd been smiling the whole time. That night, I cooked myself dinner, roasted vegetables and rice. I poured a glass of wine and sat at my tiny table, the lamp casting a golden glow over everything. There was no noise, no one to serve, no footsteps demanding attention. Just music playing softly from my phone and the sound of my own breathing. Halfway through the meal, I caught myself whispering, "So this is peace." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The next morning, Naomi came upstairs holding a notebook. "You used to write, didn't you?" she asked. "Once," I said. "A long time ago." "Then start again," she said, dropping the notebook onto my table. "Write your story, not for anyone else, just for you." When she left, I opened the notebook to a blank page, and I began. I spent 20 years taking care of a man who mistook my love for servitude. This is what happens when the servant learns she was never small. The words flowed easily, like breath, like truth. Writing became my medicine. Every morning before heading downstairs to the shop, I'd sit by the window with a pen and notebook, pouring everything I'd swallowed for years onto paper, every insult disguised as kindness, every favor that turned into an obligation, every quiet ache I'd mistaken for love. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. But it was mine. Naomi started calling it my morning exorcism. She'd bring me tea and say, "You're purging ghosts, darling. Keep going until there's nothing left but you." One afternoon, as I was helping her sort through bouquets for a wedding order, my phone buzzed. It was Sophie. "Mom," she said, her voice brisk but warm. "I've been thinking about your situation. I talked to a colleague at my firm in Boston. They handle asset recovery and divorce settlements. I think you should speak to someone local, someone who can make sure you get what's legally yours." The word yours sounded foreign. For 2 decades, everything had belonged to someone else, his house, his money, even my time. "I don't know, Sophie," I murmured. "It's not like I want revenge. I just want peace." "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about fairness. You gave him your life. The least he can do is give you back your freedom without leaving you penniless." There was silence for a moment. Then I said, "Okay, I'll do it." 2 days later, I met Grace Hollander, a lawyer Sophie had recommended. She worked out of a converted Victorian home near downtown Santa Rosa. Her office smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Grace was in her 50s, poised but disarmingly kind. She listened without interrupting as I explained my marriage, the overheard conversation, the missing beneficiary, the hidden accounts. When I finished, she leaned forward, hands folded neatly on the desk. "Clara," she said, "you are not alone. What you've described, financial control, dependency masked as affection, emotional manipulation, is something we see far too often. But here's what matters. You got out. And now you have rights." Her words made my throat tighten. Rights. Such a simple word, and yet one I'd never truly claimed. Grace explained everything: how spousal support worked, what community property meant, how my years of unpaid caregiving legally counted as labor. She outlined a plan to secure a financial settlement that reflected my contribution, not just to the marriage, but to his life. When she finished, she handed me a pen. "All I need is your signature to begin the proceedings." My hand shook as I took it. "He's going to hate this." Grace smiled gently. "Let him. Sometimes hate is the first honest thing they feel." That night, Naomi opened a bottle of wine when I told her. "To courage," she said, raising her glass. "To finally using it," I replied. For the next few weeks, the legal wheels turned quietly but steadily. Grace was efficient, letters filed, records requested, assets traced. Every day, I felt a little lighter, a little more myself, until the storm arrived. It came in the form of a knock, hard, rapid, angry. When I opened the door, Lucas stood there, red-faced and trembling. "You trying to ruin my father?" he spat. Naomi appeared behind me like a guardian angel, her arms crossed. "You need to leave." He ignored her. "You think you can steal from us? My dad's sick because of you. You've humiliated him, you—" "Enough," I said quietly. My calm startled him. His mouth opened, then closed again. "You should go, Lucas," I said. "Because the next time you come here, it won't be to talk. It'll be to explain your father's fraud in court." His eyes widened. "What are you?" "I know about the transfers," I said. "The hidden accounts. Every dollar. Every signature." For the first time, Lucas looked small, like a boy caught stealing, not a man defending his father. Naomi stepped forward, her voice low and sharp. "You heard her. Leave." He did. When the door closed, I leaned against it, my knees trembling. Naomi put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, for once, I think I am." That night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights shimmer against the glass. The world outside was quiet, unaware that something enormous had shifted. I wasn't Edward's caregiver anymore. I wasn't Lucas's target. I was my own witness, my own advocate, my own beginning. And the best part? I wasn't afraid of what came next. The day of the court hearing felt both surreal and inevitable. Grace met me outside the courthouse, a tall woman in a navy coat, her hair tied back, her voice steady as stone. Sophie had flown in from Boston the night before and stood beside me, her hand firm in mine. For the first time, I wasn't walking into a room alone. The courtroom was cold, all polished wood and echoing footsteps. Edward sat across from me, his cane resting against the table. He looked smaller than I remembered, his skin drawn, his pride dulled, his once booming voice replaced by a tired rasp. Lucas sat behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight with anger. When the judge called our case, Grace spoke clearly and without hesitation. She outlined everything. My years of unpaid caregiving, the financial control, the exclusion from the will, the secret transfers of money to Lucas. Each fact landed like a hammer on the quiet air. Edward tried to interrupt, insisting it was all family misunderstanding, that I'd twisted things in my head. But the judge cut him off sharply. "Mr. Hayes, you will have your turn." When he finally did speak, his words were as brittle as old paper. "I took care of her," he said. "She didn't want for anything." Grace stood. "With respect, Your Honor, she didn't want for anything because she stopped believing she was allowed to." For a moment, the room went still. Even Edward lowered his gaze. The proceedings didn't last long. Grace had done her homework. The evidence was airtight. When the judge read the decision, I barely breathed. The court grants Mrs. Hayes 1/3 of the marital assets and 2 years of spousal support. The words didn't sound real. Not victory, not revenge. Just justice, quiet, overdue, and deeply human. Edward didn't look at me. Lucas muttered something under his breath as they left, but it didn't matter. As we walked out into the bright California sun, Sophie turned to me and smiled. "You did it, Mom." But I shook my head. We did. That night, back in Naomi's apartment, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even open the wine she'd chilled. I just sat by the window, staring at the lemon tree glowing gold in the moonlight. Justice hadn't made me whole, it had made me clean. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the hospital. Edward had suffered another stroke. There were no emergency contacts listed, and the nurse asked if I could authorize care. I stared at the letter for a long time before calling Grace. "Transfer authorization to his son," I said. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Let the people he chose take care of him." And that was that. Days passed quietly. Naomi brought me fresh peonies one morning, their petals soft and open. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it. "Lighter," I said. "Like I finally stopped carrying someone else's story." She smiled. "Then it's time to write your own." And so I did. I turned my morning journals into essays, short, honest reflections about aging, freedom, and the rediscovery of self-worth. Naomi helped me set up a simple blog. I called it Reclaimed. The first post was titled, "The House Without My Name." To my surprise, people read it, commented, shared their own stories. Women from their 50s to their 70s wrote things like, "I thought I was the only one. You just put my life into words. Thank you for reminding me it's never too late." I spent my days writing, tending to flowers, helping Naomi with the shop, and every so often, laughing so hard my ribs ached. Sometimes, at sunset, I'd walk through the garden barefoot, dirt cool beneath my feet, air thick with jasmine. That's when I realized peace doesn't arrive as a prize. It blooms quietly, like forgiveness. And mine had finally begun to bloom. Summer came early that year, wrapping the little flower shop in honeyed light. The days began to run together in the gentlest way, morning coffee, the smell of roses and mint, Naomi's laughter echoing up through the floorboards. It was during one of those mornings, while I was trimming a bouquet of marigolds, that Sophie called. "I booked my flight," she said. "I'm coming home for a week." "Home?" I teased. She laughed. "Yes, you're home. You've earned that word." When she arrived, she carried a paper bag filled with pastries and a small card that read, "Congratulations on being reborn." I laughed, but my eyes blurred as I read it. We spent the first evening sitting in the courtyard, sipping iced tea. Naomi joined us, wearing her gardening gloves and a wide grin. Sophie looked around and said, "Mom, this place feels like peace itself." "It does," I said, "because it's built on truth." Over the next few days, Sophie helped me set up a small desk in the corner of the apartment, a real writing space, not just a kitchen table. She even bought me a second-hand laptop. "You can't keep sending your articles from your phone," she scolded. My blog, Reclaimed, had grown unexpectedly popular. One post titled, "From Being Needed to Being Seen," was shared hundreds of times. Emails began pouring in, women thanking me for giving voice to the things they were too afraid to say aloud. The more I wrote, the more I remembered who I was before Edward. I started taking evening classes in creative writing at the community college. Naomi insisted on coming with me, saying, "If you're learning how to write, I'm learning how to read again." It became our ritual class, then late-night hot chocolate at the cafe down the street, where we'd talk about life and second chances. One night, as we walked home under the glow of the streetlights, Naomi said quietly, "Do you ever think about him?" I paused. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not with hate, just understanding." He needed control to feel alive. I needed freedom to remember I already was. She smiled. "That's forgiveness, Clara." "No," I said. "It's clarity." Weeks later, a letter arrived, not from Edward this time, but from Lucas. It was short and clumsy, an apology that felt more like confession than redemption. He wrote that his father had passed away quietly in hospice, that the estate was nearly gone, and that he didn't expect anything from me, just wanted to say, "You were right about him." I folded the letter carefully and set it in the drawer, not out of sentiment, but closure. Some stories end not with fireworks, but with a sigh. That evening, Sophie and I cooked dinner together. The smell of garlic filled the room, and music hummed softly in the background. When we sat down to eat, she looked at me and said, "You're glowing, Mom, like you got your life back." I smiled. I didn't get it back. I finally started living it. After she left, I walked through Naomi's garden at dusk. The roses had begun to fade, but new buds were already forming, soft, steady, inevitable. I picked one bloom, pressed it between the pages of my notebook, and wrote beneath it, "At any age, walking away isn't loss, it's reclamation." The world doesn't punish women for leaving, it waits for them to arrive. When I closed the notebook, I felt the air shift, like the quiet before the first drop of rain. And I knew this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of everything I had been too afraid to imagine.